Welcome to English BookCast. We are diving deep into a book called The Hidden and Mystical Life of Jesus.
By Leterre.
And by A. Leterre, that's right.
We also want to take a quick moment to invite all you listeners to join the English Bookcast channel and share the video to help us grow.
All right, so let's jump into this. The Hidden and Mystical Life of Jesus.
Yes.
Quite a title. I mean, we're going to be looking at some of the more esoteric and unconventional interpretations, right, of Jesus's life and teachings. And I think what's going to be interesting here is seeing how Leterre brings in these ancient philosophies and mystical traditions. We're really going to see how those inform his unique perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, this deep dive is really for you, the listener. You gave us this book to look at, and so we're trying to extract the most interesting and insightful nuggets that we can.
Yeah, I mean, we really want to understand, how does Leterre see Jesus? And not just in isolation, but within this broader historical and religious context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, are there any surprising connections? Are there any potential aha moments that we can uncover for you?
All right, so I guess kind of starting right from the beginning, Leterre talks about this universal religious sentiment.
Right.
He actually throws out a list of names and he says, God, Allah, Bacchus, Baal, Jehovah, Mithra, Ra, Tupum.
Wow.
It's almost like he's saying that, hey, all these different cultures across time and space have had this innate sense of faith in some kind of cosmic force or power, but they just use different names for it.
Yeah, so Leterre is kind of positing this common root of faith.
Right.
That transcends those different names and rituals that we see across all these different cultures.
But then he goes on to say that even though there's this common root, that there have been divergences, in the ways that people view and worship this god. And he says this goes back a long time. Like he points to a figure named Irshu in India.
Over 5,000 years ago.
Over 5,000 years ago. And he says, look, Irshu really initiated these schisms, these breaks in the original cults. And that's kind of how things started to splinter off, so to speak.
That's really fascinating because, today we see a lot of divisions between religious groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Leterre saying, hey, that's not a modern invention. These divisions go way back in history.
Yeah, and he even makes the point that, sometimes this has led to actual hatred and even the commercialization of faith. So he's not really pulling any punches when he's talking about the consequences of these schisms.
Yeah, he's highlighting some of the darker aspects of organized religion, right? I mean, we've got like hatred and the commercialization of faith you can't deny. I mean, that's still relevant today.
It is. And then he goes on to kind of shift gears a little bit and starts talking about how ancient books describe God. And they describe God in a very particular way. They say that God is incorporeal, invisible, immaterial, without form, and therefore ineffable and unknowable by our senses.
So, the ancient wisdom traditions were saying that God is essentially beyond our grasp, beyond our ability to understand or even perceive with our senses. And Leterre gives us this quote. He says, God is ineffable, meaning that we can't even put it into words.
And it's interesting because he says these ancient books actually predicted that future generations, lacking this knowledge that they had, might mistakenly believe that past civilizations actually worshiped the stars or the planets or even animals.
Right, as if those things themselves were gods.
Right, but he's saying no, they were actually worshiping the creator god behind those representations.
So those things were, just symbolic, pointing to something deeper.
Exactly. He gives us some examples. He says, the ancient Persians called the creator god Mitra.
Right, that's during the time of Zoroaster.
Zoroaster, right. And then he says the Eleusinians and Ethiopians, Aryans, Egyptians, they had their own names.
Ceres, Juno, Bellone, Hecate, Isis. He's got all kinds of names that they used for this same idea of a creator god.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he even throws out a quote that's attributed to Isis, and it says, I am the Queen Isis. So it's almost like, these different cultures had their own sort of personifications of this divine power.
But then he shifts gears again, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He starts talking about thousands of tribes of Africa and our own indigenous people, and he describes their practices in a way that contrasts those earlier traditions.
Yeah, and this is where things get a little, I guess you could say, delicate. He says that these people direct their prayers and sacrifices to what he calls evil spirits. And they do these kind of noisy rituals to ward off those spirits. And he tries to frame this through the lens of his theses of revelation and the universality of religion. even suggesting that it could be tied to these ancient cataclysms that spread different races across the
It's
continents.
important to remember that this perspective he's offering on the beliefs of indigenous peoples is very much rooted in his own time and context. It's not a view that most people would hold today.
Yeah, absolutely. Modern anthropology offers much more nuanced and respectful understandings of these diverse spiritual traditions. And, we don't want to endorse any view that devalues or misrepresents any culture's beliefs.
It's crucial to approach these topics with sensitivity and awareness of how perspectives have evolved over time.
All right, so then Leterre really starts to kind of dig into the influence of these ancient philosophies. And he makes this really bold claim that the same ideas about God that Christians hold are actually found in all peoples. And he throws out a whole list: Platonists, Pythagoreans, Atlanteans, Libyans, Egyptians, Indians, Persians, Chaldeans, Scythians, Gauls, and Spaniards.
Wow, that's quite a list.
It is.
He's really suggesting there's this universal thread of belief across cultures.
Yeah, he's saying it's not unique to Christianity. He even points out that this theological principle of dividing the divinity into three parts, which, we see in the Christian Trinity,
Right, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
is actually shared by a lot of these ancient cultures.
He's got this idea of perennial philosophy, that these core truths exist across cultures and time.
Yeah. And then he brings in St. Augustine, this prominent figure in the early church, who he says recognized similarities between the principles of Plato and Moses.
Because they both studied in Egypt and were influenced by the writings of Hermes Trismegistus.
Hermes Trismegistus. That takes us deep into some esoteric territory.
He's this legendary sage shrouded in mystery. He's credited with these hermetic texts that were really influential in alchemy and mysticism.
Yeah, and Leterre says that these philosophies that were later labeled as pagan by the Catholic Church were actually connected to a sort of cosmic order.
The way the universe works. He even quotes St. Athanasius, St. Augustine, and the Roman archaeologist Varro to support this idea.
So he's saying that even early church fathers saw this link between what they called paganism and their own beliefs. But wait, it gets even more interesting. He claims that even modern materialists like Brasset and Ledontek might, without even realizing it, acknowledge a supreme creator.
Even when they're focused on the material world and science.
Yeah, there's this underlying recognition of some kind of ultimate source. Now let's talk about Leterre's own approach. He's very clear that his work isn't strictly scholarly or scientific.
Right. He's not trying to write a textbook or a research paper.
He says that no other Brazilian writer has approached this subject in the same way because his approach is based on something he calls the law of the word.
And that this law of the word is pretty much unknown in Brazil, and even in the sacred books of many cultures.
Yeah, so he's really emphasizing that he's coming at this from a unique perspective.
This law of the word seems central to his whole approach.
Yeah, and he even criticizes other Brazilian writers for focusing too much on the political or social aspects of religion or getting bogged down in partisan views. He says he just wants to summarize his research and awaken curiosity about the truth.
Not to impose any new doctrine.
Exactly. And he actually quotes Hermes Trismegistus again, saying, "Truth does not reside on earth because truth is that which is eternal and immutable. Everything subject to change cannot be the truth. Everything that perishes is a lie. Only God is the truth."
So truth is something beyond our changing world.
Right. And then he brings in Descartes, who believed that doubt can lead us to a greater understanding.
Questioning what we believe, not just blindly accepting it.
Exactly. But Leterre contrasts that with St. Tertullian's famous saying, "Creo por ser absurdo, credo quia ineptum." It means, I believe because it is absurd.
He's basically saying, I believe, even though it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And Leterre kind of suggests that this view is outdated, that today we need to be more critical and questioning in our approach to faith.
Not just accepting things blindly.
Right. And then kind of wrapping up this intro section, he touches on the Catholic Church's claim that faith is a gift from God, given only to some.
And he's critical of that idea, saying that it's baseless and that it excludes people who don't subscribe to their specific doctrine.
Yeah. He basically suggests that according to that view, only Catholics can access truth, which he finds problematic.
He seems to be advocating for a more inclusive and accessible understanding of truth.
Now, this is where things get really interesting. Leterre starts digging into this law of the word that he keeps talking about, and he links it to these ancient languages.
Okay, this should be fascinating.
He focuses on this word arc. He says it represents the power of manifestation and that its inversions, like kra, kar, and kri, all mean to create.
Like in Latin, we have creare, and in Irish, crythai. Similar sounds, different languages.
Exactly. So Letaire's connecting these seemingly disparate words and ideas across cultures.
And it all comes back to this concept of creation.
Right. And he goes on to say that arca is like a hymn of hymns, the poetry of the word, and matra is the measure of the principle. And he links these to other ancient terms, Bereshith from Egyptian temples, Berzet from Zoroaster, and Bharata from the divine Varata.
So he's weaving together threads from all these different traditions.
Yeah, it's like he's building a tapestry of language. And then he introduces this concept of the archaeometro.
The what?
The archaeometro, he describes it as this precision instrument that can like reveal and control the words of ancient languages.
Like some kind of linguistic decoder.
Yeah, and he says it all starts with the Vatanica or Adamic language.
The language of Adam, like from the Bible.
Well, he clarifies that he's not talking about the Adam from the Bible, like the literal first man.
Okay, that makes sense.
He's using it in a more symbolic way, drawing from the Vedic and Sanskrit meaning of Adam, which is about unity and universality.
So it's more of a philosophical concept than a historical figure.
Exactly. And then Leterre jumps into this whole discussion of trinities across different cultures.
Oh, that's a really fascinating topic.
He brings up examples from China, Persia, and even primitive Germania. So for example, he says the Chinese have a trinity of Brahma the Father, Shiva the Mother, and Buddha the Son.
Wow, so even the concept of a trinity isn't exclusive to Christianity.
Right. And then in Persia, it's Orzmid the Father, Ahriman the Mother, and Mithra the Son. And in Germania, it's Wotan, Frigga, and Diner.
So different cultures, different names, same basic structure.
And then he gets even more into the Chinese system, talking about this trinity of Yue Tao, which represents absolute unity, universal existence, and individual existence.
That's like a cosmic hierarchy.
Yeah, and he even connects it to Jesus's saying, I am the first and the last, by linking it to Tao, which is the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet. It's all about finding these hidden connections.
And the Tao is also, of course, the foundation of Taoism, which emphasizes living in harmony with the way of the universe.
Exactly. And then he talks about how Plato, in his work Alma de Mundo, which is from the 4th century BC, talks about a mysterious trinity with 3 names.
And he says Plato got it from Orpheus, who got it from Egypt.
Right? It's like this ancient wisdom being passed down through different cultures.
Vetter even asks, rhetorically, isn't this plagiarism of antiquity? He's pointing out how these ideas have been circulating for a long time.
Yeah, and it challenges this notion that religions just pop up suddenly with a brand new god. He argues that it's more of a gradual evolution and synthesis of ideas.
And he brings up Brahmanism, the religion of Krishna, as an example of this. He sees it as a synthesis of earlier ideas, something that St. Augustine called religio vera, or true religion.
Now, Leterre also talks about these ancient cataclysms, like huge world-changing events that supposedly divided and dispersed different races across the continents.
He mentions Lemuria and Atlantis, these legendary lost civilizations that supposedly sank beneath the waves.
Right, and he says that these events coincided with the emergence of things like the Andes Mountains.
It's like these cataclysmic upheavals reshaped the earth and scattered humanity.
Yeah, and he argues that it's hard to explain the similarities between different races, like the yellow race in Papiri and its supposed descent via the Atlantic, without these kinds of massive events.
Of course, there's also the theory of continental drift, which offers a scientific explanation for how continents have moved over time.
Right, and Leterre actually suggests that continental drift supports his theory of cataclysms.
It's like the pieces of the puzzle are fitting together.
Now, Leterre claims that this Monsignor, who he doesn't name, is ignorant of the pre-Christian existence of certain practices in India and Persia.
Practices that he believes were brought by Atlanteans or Indians migrating through the Cordilleras.
Yeah, and he again brings up the similarities between different races as evidence for this connection.
It's all about tracing the flow of ideas and practices across cultures and time.
He then talks about the divine synthesis represented by Tupan among Amazonian indigenous people, which he compares to the Greek god Pan and various Indian legends.
He even references Monteroyo's Tubi Guarani dictionary to support this.
He's always looking for these connections between different cultures' mythologies.
It's like a comparative mythology approach.
Now get this. Leterre brings up this account of a massive cataclysm that happened 8,060 years before he wrote his book.
That's a long time ago.
It is. And he says that this event dragged 64 million inhabitants into the sea.
Well,
And what's even more interesting is that he claims this timeline actually matches up with Plato's writings, even though they were separated by, a huge amount of time and geography.
So he's saying that both Plato and this other account agree on this ancient cataclysm.
Yeah, and he says that most scholars accept this timeline. He also points to Mayan traditions that go back over 14,000 years before Columbus and Peruvian stories about these kinds of catastrophic events.
So he's finding evidence for this cataclysm across different cultures and historical records.
And then he compares the story of Noah's flood in the Bible to a similar story in the Bhagavad.
So he's saying that the flood story isn't unique to the Bible.
Right. He says that Vishnu sent Satyavata a boat, just like God commanded Noah to build an ark.
And that this happened before the biblical flood, according to these ancient texts.
And he also mentions that China recorded a similar event before Moses wrote Genesis, so he's suggesting that Moses might have borrowed elements from these older traditions.
It's like a game of tracing the origins of these stories.
He even throws in a quick reference to the Scandinavian account involving the giant Ymir.
He's really trying to paint a picture of this flood as a global event that's remembered in different ways by different cultures.
Now, Leterre then makes this interesting point. He says that when Moses incorporated the flood and other elements into Genesis, he'd actually lost the key to the second, allegorical meaning and cosmogony, symbolized by the Sphinx and the pyramid.
What does he mean by allegorical meaning?
He's saying that these stories have a deeper, symbolic meaning that goes beyond the literal events. And he even ties this to Jesus' statement, when Abraham existed, I already was.
He's suggesting that Jesus had access to this ancient wisdom that Moses had lost.
Yeah, like there's this secret knowledge embedded in these stories. Now let's talk about the name Jesus itself. Leterre says that Catholics believe the angel Gabriel told Joseph in a dream to name his son Jesus, which means to save his people from their sins.
Right, so the name itself carries this heavy meaning of salvation.
And he specifically says the people of Israel.
So it's focused on a particular group, not all of humanity.
Now, Leterre then talks about how Jesus called himself the Son of Man, just like the prophets he revered, especially Ezekiel.
He saw himself as following in their footsteps.
And he says that Jesus felt badly received among his own.
Like he wasn't fully accepted or understood by his own people.
But Leterre emphasizes that Jesus still fulfilled and taught the law of Jehovah in synagogues to the people of Israel.
He was upholding tradition, not trying to overturn it.
Right, and he even said that not even a comma of the law would be lost until the end of time. But then Leterre shifts to the Babylonian creation myths, specifically the story of Adam.
Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah. He brings up this Babylonian deity named Ea, who is also known as the potter god. He says that the Chaldeans believed that Ea fashioned humans from clay and breathed the spirit of life into them.
And he links this to the biblical story of Adam being made from clay with God breathing life into him.
It's like a parallel creation myth.
And he mentions that this god, Eadoi, later became known as Marduk.
Right. And apparently Marduk regretted creating humans because they multiplied too much.
There are actually parts of this poem about Marduk's regret that are missing, written on ancient bricks. We don't have the full story.
Now, Leterre really gets into his element here. He argues that the seemingly simple stories in Genesis, like Cain and Abel, are actually allegorical representations of cosmic forces.
Wait, what? How does Cain and Abel represent cosmic forces?
He's saying that Cain represents, like, compressive or astringent forces, while Abel represents expansive or evolutionary forces.
So it's not about two brothers fighting, but about these deeper principles at play in the universe.
Exactly. And he says that the story of their conflict leads to the cooling of the globe, which is represented by Seth.
There's a whole different way of reading those stories.
Right. He's saying that these stories had to be told in this symbolic way because people back then wouldn't have understood complex scientific explanations. So they personified these cosmic forces as figures like Cain and Abel.
That's actually pretty clever.
Yeah. And he says that this was the basis for the famous mysteries of all initiations.
Like secret knowledge passed down through these myths.
Now, Leterre also points out some contradictions in the Bible. He brings up Moses' ancestry and how there are discrepancies in the details given in Exodus.
Like how Amram's parentage and lifespan are described differently in different passages.
Yeah, and he mentions that Aaron, Moses' brother, is said to be 3 years older than him.
Which Leterre finds strange, considering Moses was supposedly born to a Hebrew woman who was enslaved by the Egyptians.
And the Egyptians had a strict caste system and weren't exactly known for being kind to their slaves. He questions how the story of Moses being put in a basket in the Nile could even be possible, given the crocodiles.
Yeah, that part of the story always seemed a little far-fetched.
Leterre's point is that these inconsistencies suggest that figures like Moses, Aaron, and Levi might not be literal individuals, but rather symbolic representations of patriarchs, pontiffs, or theological principles.
So he's suggesting a more symbolic interpretation of those biblical figures.
Right. And he says that this makes it easier to understand the Bible's first sense and the long lifespans attributed to those figures.
It's like a different level of understanding.
Okay. Then he takes us to ancient Egypt. He quotes inscriptions from Egyptian tombs that say, "I protect, and I am with the kings of justice who are present before Amon." And he explains that Amon means law of Rama.
So he's connecting Amon to Rama, this ancient Indian figure.
Right. He says that Amon was the word of the Egyptians, and that the Egyptians' words are found in the Gospel of John.
He's drawing parallels between Egyptian religion and Christianity.
And he even quotes the Pomander, which says that God thought is the ancient light, and the radiant word of thought is the Son of God, and that thought is Godfather.
He's getting into some deep theological territory here.
He's saying that Amen was the revealed light, the divine word. Now, hold on to your hats, because this next part is wild.
I'm ready.
Leterre brings up this conflict within Christianity itself. He talks about how Dominican friars accused Jesus of sinning in his mother's womb. Yeah, they believed that he was actually Joseph's son, not the son of the Holy Spirit.
Because they believed he sinned before he was even born.
And get this. The Franciscans retaliated by staging an apparition of the Virgin Mary.
An apparition? Like a ghost?
Yeah. And they gave poison communion to a guy named Jetzer in Bern.
Oh, no.
But Jetzer refused to keep up the charade, and they tried to poison him again.
This is getting intense.
It is, and the whole thing ended with the 4 friars who were disguised for the scheme being burned alive in 1509.
Wow, that's a dark chapter in Christian history.
And Leterre says this is just one of thousands of similar incidents in the history of Catholicism.
He's really highlighting the conflicts and power struggles within the church.
Now, Leterre then talks about how there was this rumor going around at the time of Jesus' birth that a child born of a virgin would conquer India and the world.
A messianic prophecy.
Exactly. And apparently Herod was so freaked out by this that he sent someone to investigate and try to find this newborn.
He felt threatened by this potential rival.
Eldor argues that the Jewish Christian cult took elements from ancient Egyptian, Chaldean, Median, and Indian cults centuries later.
So he's saying that Christianity wasn't entirely new, but rather built on these older traditions.
And he claims that Catholicism later distorted these elements with its dogmas and rituals. He even quotes Plutarch's Isis and Osiris, where a mysterious voice announces the birth of Osiris, the great king savior of the world.
Wow, that sounds very similar to the Christian narrative.
Right. Leterre is really emphasizing these parallels. He also brings up Dupuis's view that the Christ story is an allegory, similar to those in Eastern mythologies, about the cycle of the seasons and constellations.
So the death and resurrection of Christ could be seen as a symbolic representation of the changing seasons.
Exactly. He even claims that religious authorities condemned knowledge about things like the Earth's movement, the vastness of the universe, and the possibility of life on other planets.
Because it challenged their worldview.
Right. And he even quotes the scripture, "Blessed are the ignorant, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," as justification for this suppression of knowledge.
So he's saying that the church discouraged scientific inquiry.
But then he brings up Daniel's prophecy in Babylon about the coming of the Messiah, which supposedly even marked the date as 652 years in the future, using this symbolism of times and half-times.
A very specific prophecy.
And he says a Catholic astronomer and priest actually verified this prediction.
So even within the church, there were people who were studying these ancient prophecies and trying to make sense of them.
Okay, now Leterre talks about this idea of the motherhood of God.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
He mentions the figure of Cybele in mythology.
She was a mother goddess in ancient Phrygia, associated with fertility and nature.
And he says that the name Mother of God signifies the living image of Ammon, which he connects to Rama and the law of Aries, the Ram.
So he's linking this concept of the Divine Mother to these ancient figures and astrological symbols.
He then questions how an eternal, uncreated God could even have an earthly mother. And this is where he brings up Nestorius, a Syrian priest from Antioch in 428 AD.
What did Nestorius believe?
Well, Nestorius and his secretary, St. Anastasius, preached against the established councils regarding Christ's divinity. They said that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, couldn't be confused with the Son of Mary.
So they were separating the divine nature of Christ from his human nature.
Exactly. They said that flesh can only beget flesh.
So the human Jesus was separate from the divine Son of God.
Leterre really emphasizes that his goal is to present information from history and sacred texts, not just his personal opinions.
He's trying to be objective and let the sources speak for themselves.
And he's open to having his views challenged by solid arguments. But he then digs into this question of whether the image of God that's talked about in Genesis is spiritual or material.
That's a fundamental question.
He points out that the verse from Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, which says man is made in God's image, doesn't actually specify whether that's a spiritual or material image.
It leaves it open to interpretation.
And he quotes Jesus' words, God is spirit, and it is necessary that those who adore him in spirit and truth.
So Jesus himself emphasizes the spiritual nature of God.
Leterre argues that this phrase has supreme theological value.
So we should pay attention to it.
Right. And he implies that if we ignore it, then the scriptures become incoherent.
Meaning, they wouldn't make sense.
He even points out that Protestants are more aligned with the spiritual interpretation than Catholics. He then mentions that figures like Mithra, Osiris, and Bacchus were considered sons of God in various ancient religions.
So he's, again, showing that these concepts predate Christianity.
And he points out that the Bible mentions Jesus having brothers and family members, distinct from his disciples and followers.
Some people try to reinterpret the word brother to mean something else, but Leterre takes it literally.
And then he brings up the ancient Chinese concepts of yin and yang.
The idea of complementary opposites that make up the whole.
Yeah, he says that they reside in a single cosmic principle called Tai, the Great One, or ether.
The source of everything.
And that this ether contains all beings and manifests in these two active forms, yin and yang.
He's connecting ancient Chinese philosophy to his larger argument.
And he even mentions a Dr. Verns who studied these ancient theories and found that they correspond to modern scientific discoveries.
So these ancient ideas are still relevant today.
Okay, now Leterre presents a contrasting view, maybe not his own, but one that's relevant to the discussion. This view states that Christ didn't bring a spiritual nature, but rather a perfect human nature that had been lost by humanity.
So Christ's sacrifice was about restoring our lost humanity.
Exactly. And it says that Christ sacrificed his perfect humanity to satisfy the demands of justice.
So it's a different interpretation of the meaning of Christ's sacrifice.
And that when we receive the Spirit at baptism, we're actually generating a new divine nature within ourselves.
So baptism becomes this transformative act.
But Leterre then comes back to his own perspective, saying that the divine attribute isn't a literal Son of God, but rather a spark delegated to a pure man, Jesus, to restore the original law in a world that had fallen into chaos.
So it's about restoring balance and order.
Right. He then brings up John the Baptist, who is considered a forerunner to Jesus, and he says that John wasn't actually certain that Jesus was the Messiah.
Because there were so many false messiahs at that time.
He even calls John voice crying in the desert, quoting Isaiah of the order of Rama, preparing the way for the Messiah.
So even John, who baptized Jesus, had doubts.
Leterre then quotes Jesus, who lamented about Jerusalem, saying, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how many times I wanted to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you would not have it.
It's a poignant image of Jesus longing to protect and unite his people.
And he also quotes Jesus as saying, it is necessary to walk today and tomorrow and the day after, so that a prophet does not die outside of Jerusalem.
And he identifies Jesus as this prophet.
He argues that the apostles never considered Jesus to be God, but that he was later deified by the Romans.
So he's questioning the traditional Christian belief in Jesus' divinity.
And he claims that the Catholic cult's distortions of Scripture led to two factions, the majority who believe Jesus is God, and the minority who reject that belief because of their studies.
So he's suggesting that there's a divide within Christianity itself based on how people interpret the scriptures.
He contrasts Jesus' prohibition of oaths with the Catholic practice of swearing on the Holy Gospels.
Jesus said we should just say yes or no, and that our word should be enough.
And he mentions that Jesus observed Mosaic law, including dietary restrictions like not eating pork, which Catholics don't follow.
He's highlighting the differences between Jesus's practices and those of the Catholic Church.
He also points out that Jesus had a beard and didn't shave his head, unlike Catholic clergy who practiced tonsure.
Tonsure is that practice of shaving the top of the head.
Leterre believes that Jesus was crucified because he was anti-political and anti-clerical, not because